Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's public program, All That She Carried, with the historian Taya Miles. We come to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper, president of the American Antiquarian Society, and I'm joined tonight by Deborah Hall, the founder and director of the Worcester Black History Project, our partner for this evening's program. We have some newcomers here this evening, so I'll say a few words of introduction to the American Antiquarian Society, a national research library in Worcester, Massachusetts. We collect, preserve, and share materials printed or produced before 1900 in what's now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts and ephemera of many sorts. AAS supports and welcomes scholars and readers from around the country and indeed around the world to use our reading room or to seek out digitized materials on our website. We also offer regular programming like tonight's virtual program, and I invite you to join us for upcoming programs in the coming weeks and months. This evening's is the fourth in a series we're calling Women Make History, and we hope you'll return to see others in this series. You can go to our website for continual updates, including other series related to nature and the environment, artists in the archive, history of the book, and perspectives from the collections, programs that consider one object in our collections from multiple areas of expertise, much as our speaker tonight has delved deeply into one extraordinary object. We thank you for joining us this evening. And as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to help keep this work going. Thank you. Now I'm happy to introduce my colleague, Kevin Wisniewski, to provide a quick overview on the platform we're using for tonight's program. Kevin?
Thank you, Scott, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Closed captioning is available for tonight's program via Zoom's live transcription. You can turn the closed captioning on and off with the button labeled CC on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Throughout the program, I'll be posting relevant links and information in the chat. If you'd like to save the chat to have the links available for future use, you can save the transcription by opening the chat window and clicking on the three dots in the bottom right corner. If you have any problems with your visual or audio, you can also message me in the chat, and I'll do my best to help. For the Q&A portion of our program, we'll be using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any questions for our speaker, please type them in there. The Q&A also has an upvote option. So if somebody posts something that you'd like to see discussed, be sure to click the thumbs up icon. You can place your questions into the Q&A at any point during the program. Finally, we are recording the program, and we will make it available on our website and our YouTube channel. So I hope everyone enjoys the program. Scott, back to you.
Thanks, Kevin. And now I am so happy to introduce my friend and colleague, Deborah Hall, who'll say a bit about the Worcester Black History Project and introduce tonight's speaker. Deborah Hall has over 30 years of experience working with survivors of domestic violence and addressing the intersection of race, gender, and community violence. She's passionate about social justice, social change, and empowering people. Currently, she serves as Chief Executive Officer at YWCA Central Massachusetts. She holds a BS in Political Science and African American Studies from Washington University in St. Louis, and an MS in Nonprofit Management from Worcester State University, and has served on many boards and committees in Worcester and Central Massachusetts and beyond. And she is the founder of the Worcester Black History Project, our partner for tonight's program. Deborah, over to you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here tonight, and Worcester Black History Project is proud to be a co-sponsor of tonight's events. As Scott mentioned, I am the founder of Worcester Black History Project, and if you are interested in learning more about the project, please visit us at our website. You can look forward to or look at upcoming projects that we have in the works, and also upcoming meetings if you're interested in joining us. I have been looking forward to this evening for quite some time. And I am so happy that we have an opportunity to be in conversation with Dr. Miles. I'm a huge fan, so I'm terribly excited. And what better day to be in conversation about Rose, Ashley, and Ruth and their journey than on this day when the first Black woman was confirmed for the Supreme Court. Taya Miles is the author of 6 books, including the prize-winning histories, The Dawn of Detroit, A Chronicle of Slavery and Freedom in the City of the Straits, The House on Diamond Hill, a Cherokee plantation story, and The Ties That Bind, the story of an Afro-Cherokee family in slavery and freedom. She has also published historical fiction, a lecture series on haunted plantations, a co-edited collection on Afro-Native studies, and various essays in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Atlantic, CNN.com, and other media outlets. She has consulted with colleagues at historic sites and museums on representation of slavery, African-American material culture, and the Black Native intersectional past, including, most recently, The Fabric of a Nation, quilt exhibit at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Her work has been supported by a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant Award, the Mellon Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Her latest book, All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, A Black Family Keepsake, has been awarded the National Book Award for Nonfiction, the Darlene Clark Hine Award in African American Women's History, and Lawrence Levine Award in Cultural History from the Organization of American Historians, the Pan American John Kenneth Galbraith Award for Nonfiction, and the Ennisfield Book Award for Nonfiction. All That She Carried was named a Best Book of the Year by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, NPR, Publishers Weekly, the Atlantic, Time, and more. Dr. Miles taught on the faculty of the University of Michigan for 16 years and is currently the Michael Garvey Professor of History and Radcliffe Alumni Professor at Harvard University. And now I introduce you to Dr. Miles.
Thank you so much for that, Deborah. And thank you everyone for being here with us this evening. It's such a pleasure to gather, as Deborah said, on a historic day. I got so many text messages from my family today with all kinds of memes, photographs. It's just been an exciting moment, despite the conflict and difficulty and tension that we've been experiencing in our own lives, in this country and around the world in recent weeks. I want to thank Scott Casper and the American Antiquarian Society for inviting me to talk with you this evening about my book. I'm very appreciative of that opportunity. And I especially want to thank AAS for inviting Deborah Hall to introduce this event and to be in dialogue with me and with Scott Casper after I finish offering some overview comments. Deborah Hall is an expert in survivor experiences, in issues of domestic violence and domestic crisis. And these are also lenses through which we could think about the subject matter that I'm going to be sharing with you this evening. So it is a perfect pairing, and I'm very grateful for it. I have around 15 minutes, perhaps 20 minutes, to offer a bit of a framing about the book, All That She Carried, in the hope that this will enable you to have a handhold as we move into more of a dialogue in the latter portion of the event. First, I will share that All That She Carried is my attempt to offer a broad, sweeping story of African-American enslavement, of American slavery, of Black love, of familial resilience, and of women's craft through an intimate lens, So my hope was that I could tell a big story through an intimate kind of close-up lens. And that lens became one object that was passed down through a single line of African-American kin, of African-American women, in fact. The book is a history that also brings in literature, it brings in poetry. It is an interdisciplinary kind of project, and it's centered around African-American survival. It illuminates maternal-child bonds and embroidered as well as embodied memories that withstood the terrors and techniques of enslavement and of forced separation. And so with that, what I'd like to do next is to share my screen and continue to offer a little bit more detail about what the SAC was, how it has moved across time and across locations, and how we might begin to interpret it. Please bear with me. I am just hitting buttons on my computer. Oh my, excuse me for that. So it looks like you can now see the back of the SAC, which is exactly where I want to really take us in, because this is what I was facing, what I was contending with when I began this project, sort of, because I'm showing you the back of the SAC. I'm withholding the front of the SAC, which I know that you have probably seen in other contexts, but I want to hold that back for a moment to take you to a place of origins, which was looking at an old bag, an old, tarnished, torn, discolored, and as you can see on this image, patched bag that dates back to the mid-19th century in South Carolina. So it might seem at first that there's nothing really to note about this SAC, about this textile. But one thing that I have really come out of this process with is the notion that SACs are actually quite powerful objects. They do so much, they carry so much, they hold so much over the course of human history in the lives of women and also metaphorically. So I'm going to say this. Very recently, I bought my mother a book series, and she told me that she hadn't started the books because of the cover. And I actually had to joke with my mother. It was very dear to me. I had to tell her, Mommy, everyone knows you can't judge a book by its cover. Well, this is also the case when it comes to any material object. It's the case when it comes to this textile, that you can't judge a SAC from its surface. I'm going to read to you now the first detailed description that was created about the SAC by museum curators at the Middleton Place Plantation right outside of Charleston, South Carolina. This was the first attempt to try to get an understanding of what this thing actually was. This is what the museum curators wrote in their catalog. Charleston, South Carolina, circa 1850, SAC, 1921, needlework. Plain weave cotton ground, cotton lock stitch fabrication, 3-strand cotton embroidery floss, backstitch embroidery. Height 29.11 by 16, width 15 3/4 inches. Sacks made of plain weave cotton, like this example, were manufactured for flour, seeds, and other food staples, beginning in the late 1840s with the invention of the industrial sewing machine. Unlike stitching by hand, the double locking chain stitch produced by the machine made a seam strong enough to hold heavy contents. The numerous worn spots had been reinforced with rectangles of cloth carefully hand sewn in place. Until late March of 2021, this sack was on display at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC. Currently, it is at Middleton Place, which is a plantation and National Historic Landmark in Charleston. Middleton Place only has some of the surviving buildings from the rice plantation of one of Charleston, South Carolina's wealthiest Euro-American families. And Middleton Place Foundation, which is the institute that owns and operates this plantation as a historic site, is the owner of the sack that we just saw. Soon, the sack will be exhibited at the new Charleston International African American Museum on loan from the Middleton Place Foundation. There is a whole very intriguing story about the movement of this sack, which perhaps we can get more into during our dialogue. But I found in doing this research that just as compelling of its physical movement, and actually more compelling than its physical movement, are the many stories this sack can tell us, the many stories this sack has contained over time about enslaved Black women's lives, about women's textile and craft work and creativity, about the Black family, about heirlooms and inheritances and what they mean to all of us, and about resilience in states of emergency, and finally, about love. All That She Carried and the story of the sack features a woman named Rose. Rose was a Black mother with little control over her own life and with no financial assets. She's also the person who passed down an incredible object, an incredible asset of invaluable worth, the sack that we are discussing. Rose was unfree. She was enslaved in Charleston in the 1850s, and she was about to have her child stolen from her. The image that you're seeing on the screen right now is of the home of Robert Martin, who was more than likely the owner of Rose. She more than likely lived in this home. I am saying more than likely because tracing the documentary trail about Rose's life, about her daughter's Ashley's life, was incredibly challenging, incredibly difficult, as is the case with tracing many African American families during that period of enslavement. And so we can come very far along the way to identifying who Rose was, who Ashley was, where they were enslaved, but we cannot know 100%. This is my best understanding and other scholars' best understanding of where Rose was enslaved here in this home. So Rose was about to have her daughter stolen from her in 1850s in Charleston. And this was a moment of gravity, of danger, of crisis, of threat that it's very difficult for us to imagine. When she realized that her daughter was going to be separated from her, Rose got a hold of a sack, the sack that we have just seen, and she started to pack it. One of the most beautiful things about this story is that Rose herself was also about to be shifted into a much more dire state of life. Enslavement was already dire. Enslavement was always dire. But when enslavers died, and when their property was then evaluated and divided, enslaved people's lives became all that much more precarious. This was the situation that Rose found herself in. And most beautifully, most remarkably, in that situation, Rose didn't look toward what she could do for herself. She instead looked toward what she could do for her daughter, Ashley, who was only 9 years old at this time. I try to imagine what it would have been like for Rose, and I know that I cannot even approach it. We cannot even approach it. But I try to imagine what it would have been like for her in that moment when she knew that she was about to be separated from her beloved child, and what it was that she was thinking, what it was she was feeling, what it was that she knew she had to do. The evidence that we have for considering these questions is actually the sack itself, because we do know that Rose made a call in that moment. And the decision she made was to do all that she could to try to keep this 9-year-old girl alive by packing her an emergency kit, by creating for her a care package in the form of this sack. And the sack has come to be called Ashley's sack. It was named that by the museum curators at Middleton Place because it was packed as a gift for Ashley, and it was given to Ashley by Rose. We know that Rose packed into the sack a dress, a braid, pecans, and a mother's love. We also know that none of these items survived intact with the sack, except probably certainly the love that Rose had for Ashley. In the book, I tried to think about and to contextualize the various items that Rose packed into the sack that day. I tried to think about what Rose might have been imagining, what she might have been projecting forward into the future when she placed these items into the bag for Ashley. We know that she packed a dress. Please remember, it wasn't this dress because the items have not been saved along with the sack. These are my approximations. These are my offerings of ways that we can imagine and kind of concretize those objects in our minds. So we know that Rose packed a dress. We know that Rose packed a braid of her own hair. This image is of braids that were saved in an African-American family Bible from Kentucky. We know that Rose packed pecans. And these images are from a later period, from the 1930s, but they show African-Americans who are gathering pecans and using pecans for trade in Louisiana. And we know that Rose packed love. Love is probably impossible to depict. It's impossible to capture through images. So I selected this one, which is of enslaved people on a plantation in South Carolina. It is of a community. And within that community, there had to be love. There had to be expressions of affection and care. Otherwise, children, families, communities would not have been sustained through the terror of the period of slavery. But when I show this image, I think it's always important to add a note and to say that Black communities were still communities. They're communities like any other. Black people are people. We are people like any other. Within these communities, there, of course, would have been conflict. There would have been disagreements. There would have been tension. There would have been people betraying one another. We know that this is the case. So love, the existence of love, the fact of love, does not indicate, does not suggest that we're not discussing complex relationships, complex people with the full range of human emotions that they experienced and that they traded and exchanged among them. So we know that Rose packed this sack for Ashley on the eve of their separation. that Ashley passed it down to her own granddaughter, whose name was Ruth Middleton, and that Ruth Middleton, a free woman who moved north to Philadelphia during the first wave of the Great Migration, embroidered this sack with the family story that I have just shared with you and that I write about in All That She Carried. By embroidering the sack, Ruth Middleton saved it for history. She preserved the words. She preserved the evidence that these things took place. And she sealed that history with thread and with a remembrance of a Black mother's eternal love. As you can see, as some of you can see here on the screen, Ruth Middleton sewed the following lines. My great-grandmother Rose, mother of Ashley, gave her this sack when she was sold at age 9 in South Carolina. It held a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, braid of Rose's hair. Told her it be filled with my love always. She never saw her again. Ashley is my grandmother, Ruth Middleton, 1921. The embroidered story of forced separation and loss on this sack, so common in the history of African American slavery, and yet breathtakingly particular to this mother and this daughter, tells us not only that Black women survived the atrocity of captivity, but it also tells us how, through identifying the physical and emotional needs of their children and their loved ones, and by generously providing those essential things to the best of their ability. Food, clothing, shelter, identity through lineage, and most centrally, an affirmation of worth and belonging, which only comes through love. This bag was no ordinary object, but instead a prescription for survival and evidence of emergency planning in the face of disaster. In the material culture of African America, it is one of a kind. And in the current nexus of national crisis, it can perhaps be a model and an inspiration of what becomes possible, what can be survived when we embrace and pass down love. Rose's hope for her daughter's perseverance was realized. Her vision for Ashley, alive and cared for, did come to pass. We know this because Ashley persisted, as did her daughter, whose name was Rosa, and her daughter, whose name was Ruth, and her daughter, whose name was Dorothy. We know this because Ruth Middleton kept the evidence, told the story, sewed it down, and through those actions brought forward into our time the words of her enslaved foremothers. So I am going to stop there with my thanks for your attention through that. And we're going to shift into a dialogue.
Taya, thank you so much. This book is extraordinary, and I know that many of those who are watching tonight have read the book, and I hope that those of you who haven't yet will do so. You describe the book in your own words as an invitation for those who would honor histories of the lost to embrace the spaces between the stitches. That's such a lovely metaphor for what you do as a historian. whether it's attending to the spaces between the stitches on the fabric or the gaps in the written archives, because there's so much that the written archive doesn't tell. And perhaps also it's a metaphor for the histories we write, which have their own stitches and spaces and gaps.
Working with the sewing metaphors opened so much for me when thinking about the process of doing history and the process of engaging in scholarship, Scott. And so I love it that you seized on that and that you asked me about it. I am certain that if Ruth Middleton had written down these words on a piece of paper, and that's what we had to consider, I would never have arrived at some of those interpretations around spaces and even around stitching and piecing together, which is something that Ruth Middleton had to do when she sewed the story onto the stack. It's something that we also do as scholars of history, practitioners of history, and many of us do that work, whether or not we are professors, teachers, academics who do that work in our daily lives, we do that work as family historians and genealogists. We piece things together, we stitch together narratives, and we seek out those narratives that are meaningful to us. The spaces that I write about in the book and the spaces that you just pointed to, Scott, are all the things that we don't know, the things that we can't know, the things that we can't access because, of course, we're not living in the past, we're living in our present day. We can't go back there. And we don't know the fullness of what happened. There are gaps in the evidence, there are gaps in our interpretation, and thinking about spaces, almost embracing the spaces, I think gives us permission to accept that. When we accept that, I think that we become more open to looking for and considering and treating with respect histories of people who didn't leave these large caches of written documents and the kind of evidence that scholars tend to look to in history about their lives.
Professor Miles.
You just
Deborah, can you please?
There we go. There we go. I told Scott, you know, we've been doing this for 2 years and I still haven't gotten it right. Unmute yourself.
happens to all of
do
us.
the same thing in
Happens
my
when we
life.
start talking. It's just going to happen. But I was just moved at the end, seeing the stack, and once again, just what Ruth documented on that sack. But of the 3 items that Rose put in the sack, I think the braid resonated with me the most. You know, historically in romantic fiction, I would encounter when you leave a lock of hair, right, for your beloved. It's usually a separation is soon to come. And this is this lock they're leaving you to remember them. However, as you wrote, hair was an arena of personal struggle with political implications for the owned and the owners. In this case, then, hair takes on an additional meaning. Hair has been both a source of oppression and liberation, right? Particularly in the Black community and Black women. And, you know, I can think in the last couple of weeks, this controversy around it. We recently, Mr. Black History Project in you know, conjunction with another program, just had a whole event around hair. Can you talk a little bit about the braid as a statement of autonomy and liberation for Rose?
Oh, Deborah, you know, we could say so much about hair. We know we could, right? And many of the people who are in the Zoom space right now with us, I know that you could also join in this discussion about hair. I want to actually just pause for a second to say that we appreciate the comments in the chat. Thank you for those. We see those. We're so glad you're here. And a shout out to Professor Rafia Zafar, who was actually a graduate student instructor of mine when I was back in college. Thank you for being here. All of us, I think, could talk about the deep and complex and multiple meanings that hair holds for African Americans, for women, and for people. We do so much signifying through our hair. Deborah, you and I are doing it right now, right? We know we're signifying through our hair, right? We've made choices about this. This is purposeful.
Right.
And these signals are communicated and they are picked up within social context. So when Rose decided to cut off a braid of her own hair, she was doing something that I think was quite dramatic. Just quite dramatic. And I mean, if we had the whole time to talk about hair, we would. Maybe I'll say a few more things beyond what you asked me specifically about, Ms. Deborah. But what I think she was doing with that was, first of all, she was providing Ashley with something that she thought Ashley needed and could use. And I think that something that she was providing through her hair was a connector. It was a symbol, a physical, material symbol of the connection between the mother and the daughter. It was a symbol of their family lineage. It was something that was visual. And so in that way, it could have almost functioned like a photograph. Where actually she could hold it, she could look at it, she could see it and then imagine her mother. It was a part of Rose's own body, which means that Ashley had her mother physically with her, even after their separation. And how magical is that? That Rose was able to give her daughter a part of herself, a part of her body. And in taking that action, Rose also, I think, was sending a message to the people who claimed to own her, the people who legally owned her. I think that message was something like, you might be able to sell us. Maybe you can separate us. Maybe you can claim that we are property. Maybe you can say that you own us, but actually, this body belongs to me. And this body belongs to the child that I birthed. By cutting off her own braid, she was claiming ownership, I think, of her body. She was saying that it belonged to her. And in the book, Deborah, I have a number of passages that I culled from the narratives of enslaved people that they had written themselves or that they had spoken to interviewers for the Federal Writers Project, and tried to identify examples where Black women's hair was being described and discussed. In a number of these examples, Black women were having their hair cut off by their owners, male or female owners, both, as a means of punishment. Oftentimes as a means of an attempt to control their bodies in terms of controlling the ways in which their bodies might have been seen as sexually attractive to white men. So white men tried to exert control over that, and white women tried to exert control over that. An action they took repeatedly as a way to say, this Black woman belongs to me, or as a way to say, this Black woman must not be viewed as attractive by you, was cutting off Black women's hair. So enslavers did claim the right to control Black women's hair. Cutting hair was sending a message. And I think when Rose cut her own braid, she was sending a powerful message, which was rejecting all that and saying, my hair, my body, my love, my lineage is for my family, it's for my daughter. And I feel that I've gone on probably way too long on that. There's so much more to say about hair, but I think I'll just pause it there and maybe try to come back to it later.
somebody mentions Linda Brent or Harriet Jacobs, which you reference in your book. And again, that's a whole class. So I won't delve into that, but the cult of true womanhood. And I just think about it. I was just telling a friend of mine this morning, Black women couldn't be considered women, ladies, because you had to be pious, pure, right? Submissive, not by choice, for sure. And we weren't domestic. We didn't own. We made a way out of no way, but definitely there's a whole lot. Professor Miles, I'll stop also to unpack. But
I'm very, very tempted to walk right through that door.
I want to so bad.
That you opened. Scott, is that okay with you if we just kind of
walk through it? Yeah, go through that
okay.
door. You bet.
Okay, great. So I think the next question is Scott's, which is why I want to just be sure. So thank you for mentioning that in the chat, whoever posted that. Yes, Harriet Jacobs is an intellectual whose work I really rely on in all that she carried. Harriet Jacobs was an enslaved girl and teenager and young woman in Eaton, North Carolina. She fashioned her own escape over a prolonged period of time in an incredibly ingenious way. And then she wrote a narrative about her experience during enslavement when she was in New York working as a domestic servant for a wealthy white family. And Harriet Jacobs writes about a number of people in her enslaved community. She has a very broad view of how slavery poisons everyone who is touched by the system. She talks about how Black people suffered, how white people became corrupted by the system, by its practices, by the ideology that held it together and made it possible. And she talks extensively, if not always directly, about her own sexual vulnerability as an enslaved teenager. She was being sexually harassed, she tells us, by the man who owned her. That ownership is a bit complicated, but he owned her. She actually belonged to his daughter, but he owned her. And there's sort of there's a gap, there's a space in Harriet Jacobs' narrative around what actually happened with that man who is referred to as Dr. Flint in the narrative. We know that he harassed her. I think many scholars have interpreted that he sexually abused her. I am someone who thinks that most likely did happen, but she doesn't say that for sure and precisely because of this cult of true womanhood that has been raised in the chat. There was the expectation that Black women should still live up to these idealized standards of Euro-American middle-class womanhood, even when everything about their life circumstances, their conditions, their captivity made that impossible. And Harriet Jacobs, who I should say for clarification for anybody who hasn't read the narrative, she in the narrative, she describes her experiences in the voice of Linda Brent. Linda Brent is the pen name that she writes under. Harriet Jacobs suffers deeply, tremendously with this contradiction, with this tension that she was raised to have Christian views, by her grandmother who had been enslaved, but who was free through a large portion of Harriet Jacobs' life. She had been raised to believe and to think that as a woman, she had to be sexually pure and virtuous. She wanted to be that, but there was no possibility for this in her life, just none. So it's the reality for enslaved Black women. And so hair played into this, the ways in which Black women took care of themselves, presented themselves, and were perceived by other Black people and also by white people. And dress figures into this as well. And so I do think that some of the items that Rose packed actually were caught up in this swirl of what it meant to be a woman, of enslaved Black women's desires and wishes to be treated as girls and as women. And on this, I want to say that right now in 2022, we are living in a moment of complex understandings of gender categories, gender expression, and the meanings of gender. So I think it might be a little hard for us to project our minds back into this period, but I think we have to try to understand better what someone like Harriet Jacobs would have been experiencing, or what Rose and Ashley would have been experiencing. Black women were not afforded the respect and the regard and the protections that white women, especially white women with means of the middle classes and upper classes, were given in American society. And that protection could mean the difference between being someone whose body was viewed as open access to any white man, and being someone who felt they had the right of protection from sexual assault, sexual abuse, and so on. And we know that white women did not have perfect protection. We know that white men did abuse white women, but they did have the expectation of protection, the guise of protection, and a certain degree of protection. And Black women had none of it because it was impossible legally to rape a Black woman. When a perpetrator raped a Black woman, that perpetrator was only, according to US law, violating the property of those who owned her. And of course, if it's your own property, is it really a violation? No. And in fact, white men who were in slaveholding families, who engaged in sexual abuse and assault of Black girls and women, could increase their profits by committing sexual assault. Could and did increase their profits by committing sexual assault. And so the desire to be treated as women was real for Black women. And this was something that I needed to trace out and think about in many ways in the book, because it came out not just in questions of hair and hairstyling and self-presentation and in dress, and how it was that Black women wanted to clothe their bodies and why a dress might have been important for Rose to pack for Ashley. But it also came out, I think, in the very way in which Ruth Middleton decided to preserve and tell that family story. It's not an accident that she sewed the story onto a fabric. That seems to me to have been very purposeful. That seems to me to have been Ruth engaging in a conversation about Black womanhood, about femininity, about gentility, about who has the right to be viewed as the kind of woman who might sit in a parlor and embroider a piece of fabric.
I thought that your discussion of Ruth was fascinating and moving, because you found more evidence of her as she lives her life in Philadelphia in the 1930s, and she becomes part of an African-American, would you call it a middle class? Would you call it, I'm not sure what you would call it, but she's certainly part of a kind of fashionable community, and for which embroidery would be one of the accomplishments of a woman. And you have photographs of women's organizations where, hair and dress are also very important, and it's part of appearance and how, in a sense, she has made it into that world.
Yes, absolutely. And your comment sent me thinking in two directions at once, Scott. One thing I wanted to say in response to that is, yes, there was a lot more evidence about Ruth Middleton than there was about Rose and Ashley. And that evidentiary reality really like I want to say compelled me, but I suppose I didn't have to do it. So I'll say that it inspired me to rearrange the way in which I told the story, to rearrange how I put the different events down onto the page and in what order. Because Ruth doesn't come up until the very end of the story. I mean, she's the person who writes this down via stitching, and yet I bring her up right away in the book itself. And that's partly because I had much more evidence about Ruth. I was able to get a clearer sense of her as a person because we just have many more documents and images from the 20th century. And I also made this shift in the order in which I presented the women and told the story, because I came to see Ruth, and this should have been obvious to me much earlier on in the process, but I came to see Ruth as someone who was herself an historian, that she was an oral historian. She was listening to her grandmother. She was taking in that family story. I can only imagine she heard it many, many times. And she made the choice to record it. That's what oral historians do. And once I saw her in that light, I thought, okay, we need to start the telling of this sack and the women who packed it and gifted it and carried it and tended it with an opening that presents the person who made it all possible, with an opening that presents the person whose thinking set all of this in motion in terms of the preservation of that set of events. So in many ways, the material that was available and my thinking about the material and realizing, oh my goodness, this is incredible that we see, or that we can gather from the inscription that Ruth heard that story. That all led me to put her at the beginning of the book and also at the end of the book. So there's sort of a circular form to it, that we begin with Ruth and the notion that she meant to preserve this family history. And then we end with Ruth doing just that in the way that you said, Scott, through textile. And, you were struggling to find a way to place Ruth within the class categories that we think of. And so did I. So did I in the book. I didn't quite know what to make of her and how to think of her, because Ruth was somebody who was doing domestic work her whole life, as were her foremothers, but of course in different contexts and in different time periods. Ruth did seem to move up in a scale of the kind of domestic work she was doing, as did her mother before her. So her mother, who was Rosa, seems to have been working in a university context, University of South Carolina, as a domestic servant. And Ruth was working as a domestic servant, possibly for professors in the Philadelphia area. She ended up working as a waitress in a home for part of that time. And so there are different gradations of domestic work that we can see Ruth moving through. But she was never someone who clearly had obtained an education. She didn't have a professional job. She didn't have a job that in between a professional job and let's say a job where she was working with her hands in domestic service. She didn't have a skilled craft or a skilled area of work that she seemed to have obtained. And yet this woman was jet setting all around the East Coast. I mean, she had friends who apparently had more means than she did, and she was going to Atlantic City with them, wearing these beautiful outfits. Ruth's outfits were described in numerous articles in the Black press in Philadelphia. It is incredible. It's incredible the kind of attention given to this woman's clothing, and that to me just helps me to picture her and to see her as closer to a fuller person than I could with Rose and Ashley, but also pointed me right back to Rose, who packed that dress. I mean, I love it that the dress is in a way a through line across the generations. Rose packed a dress for Ashley. The sack inscription said that it was a tattered dress. And here we have Ruth Middleton, by the end, this fashion plate, this paragon of style for her community. I feel like it's just a wonderful storyline in terms of the possibilities that Black women could make for themselves, could make together, could make in family, and could make in community. Because I just want to stress, before we move on, that Ruth was a part of a Black community in Philadelphia. That community seems to have been a cross-class community. This is why she had friends, with whom she could travel, even while she was working as a domestic worker. This was a community that had all kinds of social gatherings. This was a community that went to church together. It was vibrant, it was real, it was supportive. And I think that it made Ruth's life and her daughter Dorothy's life so much richer, and also probably quite a bit different from what we know of Rose's life and Ashley's life, which is not very much, but we do know that they were ripped apart from one another.
Yeah. We have a bunch of questions coming in from our viewers, and so I'd like to turn to a few of them, if that's all right. And I'm going to put some of them together because time is short. But several of our listeners have asked about the sack and the museum. So Kathleen Donegan asks, was it Ruth who donated the sack to the museum? How did the sack go from being a family heirloom to be a museum object? Was this an expression of Ruth's historical consciousness? And then Catherine Golden asks a related question. And I should also say, Kevin, I hope you're going to save these questions and answers to send to Dr. Miles after, because they're wonderful and they express such love for this book. Catherine Golden says, my question is about the journey of the sack through time and through hands. How can we reckon with plantation home sites, the very spaces of bondage, sometimes still managed by descendants of enslavers, acting as owners of the precious things, to borrow from your words, once belonging to enslaved people? It's difficult to grapple with.
Well, to each of you, thank you for those comments and questions. You said it. I will respond and offer some of my thoughts on that, but you said it. You've captured what is a real source of tension that exists within this story and exists within this history and what we know about the movement of the sack. So first to answer the question, and then to go to the comment. If only I could say that, yes, I think the sack's existence at a plantation site was an expression of Dorothy's historical imagination. If only. But we don't have any indication of that. What seems to have been the case is that Dorothy, Ruth's daughter, may have inherited the sack. It makes very good sense that she would have. That would have been what Ruth would have wanted and what would have happened. And that she then may have lost the sack either during her lifetime, or that the sack may have been lost upon her death. It seems that Dorothy Middleton may have died without a lot of means, and it's not known what happened to her possessions. We can only begin to imagine what happened to her possessions. Okay, in fact, I will just add in here that I was fortunate to be part of a conversation at the Family Research and History Center at the Smithsonian African American Museum. And much of that conversation was about African American people talking about how they had lost so many family items that they loved. And they lost these things because they had to move to a different housing situation, sometimes because of a lack of finances, and sometimes because an elderly relative needed a different kind of care. Or they lost these things because they didn't know at the time that they might have been meaningful or valuable. And now looking back, they see that they were. There is so much loss. And there definitely was a breach or a space between Ruth's time and her daughter Dorothy's time with the sack and our time with the sack. What happened in between, we don't know yet. Maybe someone will find this out, and I would love to know. And I would find it so moving, as I'm sure that we would all, if any of the contents of the sack would be found. That would be absolutely incredible. But we don't know what happened. All we do know is that in 2007, a flea market shopper in Tennessee found the sack in a bin of old rags. This bin was marked at something like $20, and the shopper was looking through it. She picked up the sack. Maybe she flipped it over. I actually don't know which side of it she encountered first. She read it and she thought there's something here. She went to the vendor. She hoped that she could kind of quickly pay and leave the flea market with the bin. And then she started doing some research online and came up with Middleton Place because, of course, Ruth Middleton Place share a name. The flea market shopper contacted the plantation and she talked with staff there, and she decided to basically donate the sack to Middleton Place in exchange for a small recognition of her contribution and also a lifetime membership at Middleton Place. This irony is lost on none of us, right? I mean, I spent probably many an hour just wrestling with the fact that Rose, Ashley, and then Ruth spent their lives trying to experience some kind of freedom, including emotional freedom, that Ruth made the choice to leave South Carolina. She made the choice to start a new life in Philadelphia, to start a family in Philadelphia with that sack. She brought that sack with her. And then the sack is sent right back down there, right back down to the state where she was held in bondage. Yes, it is difficult. It feels the opposite of poetic that this is happening with the sack. It's a tension. But at the same time, and I try to think about this out loud in the conclusion of the book, at the same time, we could imagine worse outcomes for the sack. We can imagine many things that could have happened to the sack that we would not have wanted to come to pass. What if this particular flea market shopper had bought it? What if somebody bought it who didn't see the inscription, didn't read it, didn't take the time to research it? What if somebody bought it? And what if they were using this precious object as a rag for, cleaning their car? And then we can imagine so many things. In the end, the sack is owned by a foundation, which used to have at its head a descendant of the Middleton family. This person is now retired, but still very much involved in the foundation. This is all true. But the sack is being cared for. It was Middleton Place curators who were the first people who did that initial research. They were the people who started the process of preservation. They were the people who brought the sack into the public eye. If they hadn't done that, perhaps curators at the Smithsonian African American Museum, I shouldn't say perhaps, well, I think it's a fact that if they hadn't done that, those curators would not have known about the sack, and many of us would not know about the sack. So, yes, a very difficult situation. I think I may have answered the question and responded to the comment, all at once. And I thank you. I thank you both for those thoughts.
I think so. Thank you. few more questions. I'm not going to be able to get to everything tonight because we have quite a lot. Manisha Sinha writes, "Thank you so much, Taya, for this beautiful book. I was wondering if you could talk about how you're able to recover both the beauty and the love of the enslaved, along with the terrible brutality of slavery. Could you also talk about how one can use material objects and unconventional sources like Ashley Sack to recover the history of the lives of the enslaved?"
Well, hello to Professor Sinha. I relied quite a bit on your work, on her work, in trying to understand the political context of the South Carolina that Rose and Ashley would have been born into. So, it's wonderful that you're here, Manisha. In terms of trying to find the love and trying to balance the beauty and brutality, I think the first thing I will say here is this is the way that I was introduced to histories of African American enslavement and the histories and experiences of Black women, was through the beauty and the love and the brutality. Because this is what Black women write about in their memoirs and narratives of slavery and in their fiction. And one of the most important books for me when I was in graduate school was Toni Morrison's Beloved. And there's the title right there before us. And those of us who read the book or seen the film know that beloved in itself, just that word, is vexed, and it's full of so many different meanings. It's about love. It's also about terror. It's about loss. It's about motherhood, the impossibility of Black motherhood. All that is captured in that word. And yet the word is beloved. It is about being beloved. It's about loving. And Toni Morrison, she, of course, is the master, in my view, of capturing that dynamic of beauty and brutality. I mean, the way she described that plantation in Kentucky, Sweet Home, the beauty of the landscape and the horror of what unfolded there, it is remarkable. And this was how I was introduced to understanding that slavery was through both and. Morrison's novel for me just epitomizes that, but Harriet Jacobs' narrative also is such an important place for seeing that love, for seeing that terror combined. And so, Manisha, it's not really a choice, I don't think, if we want to try to capture what the experience of enslavement was for Black people. But it certainly can be a choice when it comes to balance, how much of this, how much of that, what to say, when to say it, how to say it. It is an easy thing, and it has happened to me often, that we can fall into this depth of despair when we work with these sources. You know this, Manisha. Other people, who are in the same space, you know this. It's a very, very difficult place to dwell, and I think that it could be possible for us to tip the weight of our attention and our interpretation toward all of that. But if we did that, I actually don't think we would be seeing Black lives in the way that Black people have told us they lived them. And so I think we have to just really strive to look for the love, to look for the connection, to look for the creativity, to look for the resilience as we try to recapture and tell these histories of enslavement. And yes, material culture and objects are important ways that we can approach this kind of telling. Because I try to talk about this in the book, and I try to explain my thoughts about it there. The documentation that we have about enslaved people's lives mostly comes from enslavers. It's mostly a set of very cold and chilling, cold and chilling descriptions. No, that's even too generous. Cold and chilling lists and notations of what happened to Black people, what was done to them. what was distributed to them, the kind of punishments that were meted out to them, the kinds of words of criticism and degradation that were used to talk about them and to categorize them. That's what we mostly have in archives. Now, of course, we do have memoirs of enslaved people. We do have some letters, and I've already referred to those in our conversation tonight. Those are so vitally important to trying to find balance and to trying to represent that sense of love and beauty. But you walk into the archives of the South and the archives of the North, and we're going to see these lists, these slave lists. We're going to see bills of sale. We're going to see wills and inventories of people's estates that dehumanize African American people and indigenous people as well during the period of their enslavement. Material objects can tell us a different story, and I think that the sack exemplifies that so wonderfully. I mean, just imagine the kind of story that we could tell about Rose, Ashley, and Ruth without the sack. Well, you don't have to imagine. I think in the book, I try to lay out, here's what we have. Here are the documents we have about them. It's basically nothing. Oh, bill of sale. Oh, you're worth $200. Oh, that's what it is. These objects can help us to tell the history in a different way, but they can also help us to see the history in a different way. Because when we think about, and if we can touch them, we're even luckier. When we think about the objects that enslaved people interacted with, we are really forced to think about the ways in which, those minute ways in which they live their daily lives, because we live our lives with objects. We live our lives with objects. It opens up a whole new way of seeing.
It does. And I want to, I think this will be the last set of questions. Glenna Matthews says, not a question, but a comment. I love the images in the book, especially the one of the quilt by Rosie Lee Tompkins, pseudonym for Effie Mae Howard. The late collector Eli Leon was a friend, and through him, I had the privilege of meeting Miss Tompkins. Eli would be so thrilled that his collection is being put to this use. And I was thinking, this is connected to something I was thinking about, because in the middle of the book, there's this one, you have a wonderful visual essay that you call Carrying Capacity, which is co-curated by yourself and Michelle May Curry. It includes contemporary art by Black artists that reimagines Ashley's sack. And so I was interested in knowing how this became part of the book, and that in a way connects to Glenna Matthews' question here about the use of other wonderful objects to think through your story.
Thank you for the question in the chat and also what you added to it, Scott. Yes, there is a visual essay in the middle of the book, which was quite a thing to take on because I am not a visual studies scholar by any means. It was a bit of an intimidating thing to take on. The way that that essay came into being was really that I did see early on, as I'm sure you have too, that the sack is a work of art. I tend to gravitate toward text, just kind of the way I'm built and the work I do. So I was very focused on the words, also beautiful, but it is a work of art. It is a work in which Ruth Middleton created and fashioned something out of her imagination, out of the input of that oral history. She made artistic choices around the thread color and the shape of the embroidery, around the sizing of the embroidery. And she was both preserving something and communicating something through that artistic expression. So I know I had to think about the sack as a work of art, which set my mind in a direction of considering the histories of art. And I also always felt while working on this project that this sack is an object for us to sit with and to meditate with and to think about today when we consider a number of the dilemmas that we face. I think the sack is just a wondrous thing, and that the women who had a hand in fashioning it and passing it down were brilliant people, and we can learn from all this. it was my thinking about the relevance of the sack today that led me to consider contemporary artistic expressions. So seeing the sack as art, thinking about its relevance, led me to contemporary expressions. And that inkling, that interest and that feeling was only enhanced by a comment that an artist and an art historian, a scholar of art, made to me when I presented the work while it was in progress at Columbia University. This was Kelly Jones. And again, she is an artist and she is a scholar of art. She said to me that the sack was not unique. This was actually a really important thing that she said. At the time I thought, what? Of course it must be unique. But it's wonderful to get constructive critique and constructive questions that push you, because I went back and I thought about this. Is the sack unique? And then I began a search along with a graduate student of mine at the time, Michelle May Curry, to identify things, objects that might be close to the sack or somewhat like the sack. And we searched far and wide. And Michelle May Curry actually is a specialist in visual representations and artistic representations of Black life. So we looked at quilts, we looked at other bags, we looked at various kinds of textiles, we looked at pottery. Some of that comes up in the interpretation of the book, especially Black pottery making in South Carolina is an element that I go into a bit. And we looked at contemporary story quilts by artists like Faith Ringgold. This is how we came upon Miss Tompkins' work, which is not a story quilt per se, the image that's in the book, but it is a quilt that has a Bible verse on it. It has words when she's doing so many things visually and textually with that quilt. And what I ended up concluding was the sack is unique. And I'm so grateful for the challenge because it made me do that hard work. The sack is unique, but it does have other art objects that it can talk with, that it can listen to and talk back to. And together, when we see them, I think we can have a deeper understanding, a broader understanding of what the sack actually means and how it can resonate for us today. So that was the genesis of that essay. And Michelle May Curry is, of course, a graduate student who now Dr. May Curry, who helped me with that initial research. And we co-wrote the text. She co-curated the pieces. She chose the order of the pieces. And so much of that is her kind of visual imagination on the page. I had played with titling the book Carrying Capacity, Scott. So I wanted to get that in there somewhere. I wanted to include that language, which says so much about the sack and its possibilities and its powers. And also for me, it says so much about the questions of environmental risks and threats, which this book is also about, but I think in a more subtle way.
That's a wonderful note on which to end a great discussion. I will note we have other questions we didn't get to, including greetings from our President Emerita, Ellen Dunlap, President Emerita. Yes, yes, yes.
Oh, Scott, do I have 1 second? Just one
yes,
second.
You bet.
So, okay. So I want you all to know that I went on an American Antiquarian Society trip to Charleston however many years ago with Ellen Dunlap and others. It was incredible. I learned so much. It's how I kind of got into some of the more secret places of many of these sites that I think about. It got me thinking about rice and about agriculture and about plants and food. It utterly transformed how I was beginning to think about those pecans. And so I'm thrilled that Ellen's here to say that.
Yeah. And thank you for that. And other expressions just of gratitude for your book and of admiration for what you've accomplished. So we will keep track and save that and send all of that to you so that you know all the people who are expressing their admiration and their love. I want to thank you, Taya Miles, for this conversation. And I want to thank Deborah Hall of the Worcester Black History Project for our partnership and Thanks to all of you who've been watching. So many of you came out tonight, and we're so grateful. If you'd like to recommend the program to friends, our public programs are available, and this one will be available on the AAS YouTube channel. So please let folks know. We have a number of programs coming up in the next month. The next one is Tuesday, April 19th at 3 p.m. when Brian Ogren will talk about the colonial Kabbalah of the Jews at the American Antiquarian Society. We have much more coming up. Check out our website, americanantiquarian.org, for all of that. And one final note for our viewers in the greater Worcester area. After more than 4 years, weekly tours of the American Antiquarian Society will resume on Wednesday, April 20th at 3 p.m. So check out our website for more information. We look forward to welcoming you back to Antiquarian Hall. Taya Miles, Deborah Hall, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you, and have a good evening.